Okay, hello. All right, so first I'm going to talk about angels. Um, so remember, first of all, like what we saw about intelligible substances and sensible substances in Plotinus, right? Like a sensible substance it's not really a substance, or anyway, it's a substance in a lower sense. It's just some accidents in matter, but we call it a substance because it's an image of an intelligible substance. Um, right. So this is an intelligible substance as paradigmatic cause. Right. In addition to the four Aristotelian causes, the efficient cause, final cause, formal cause, and material cause, the Neoplatonists introduced two others, the paradigmatic cause and the organic or instrumental cause. So this is the paradigmatic cause. Um, it's right, it's not a cause of this sensible substance in any other way in Plotinus, I think. I mean, although Plotinus is hard to understand, so that's hard to be sure. Um, um, but another way that you can understand the relationship between it. So this is one way of understanding the relationship between an intelligible substance and a body. The body is a representation of the intelligible substance, it's an image of it. Um, so a different way of understanding the relationship between intelligible substance and a body um, is, and the people who thought this considered it to be Aristotelian, although it's not at all clear that it's Aristotle's own view. So, well, I mean, I guess I should say, in some sense, it's clear that it's Aristotle's view. So, an intelligible cause as a motor, meaning something that causes motion. I mean, the question is, does it cause motion? So, at least a lot of people think that Aristotle really believes that intelligible causes cause motion as final causes, not as efficient causes, right? So that these things move around because they want to be like the intelligible cause. So there is still a kind of imaging relationship here, right? Like the eternal circular motion. This circle here is like a celestial sphere, right? And the Earth is in here. So the eternal circular motion of the celestial sphere is its way of imaging the um, immobile, eternal, intelligible cause. Um, but uh, but that imaging relation also involves some kind of transient causation, whether it's final or, as at least the early medieval people tend to think, also efficient. Meaning it causes the motion, somehow causes the motion of the sphere in the way like something pushing something causes its motion. Um, and like, uh, so these are two different ways of looking at the relationship between an intelligible substance and a body. Um, and the other thing to add into the picture is that these intelligible substances in the early Middle Ages were called angels, right? Like how exactly that got started, I'm not sure. Like who established that equivalence? I don't know if it was Philo or um, the church fathers, or I don't know exactly. No, it wasn't the church fathers because we have to be someone who reached the early Islamic Middle Ages. Um, So anyway, I'm not sure, but by the early Middle Ages, that equivalence is like everyone knows that an angel is an intelligible substance. So like um, and these people are Aristotelians, so they mostly think of angels this way, right? So just as Aristotle says there are 51 gods, that's what he calls these things, right? One for each sphere. These people would say, well, there's 51 angels. That is, there's not very many angels. And angels are not very interesting because they don't really do anything, right? They're eternally the same and they always have the same effect. And their primary effect is to move these spheres around. Um, Now, I mean, especially the lowest one. So again, most of these people in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages think that something called the active intellect is like the intellect of the sublunar world. You don't have to know all of this stuff, but I mean, but I have to say it to explain what I'm gonna, right? So like this is the active intellect. This is something that Aristotle discusses in the third book of the De Anima, and like there's been controversy basically ever since about what he means by the active intellect. The later medieval people, that is the Latin medievals, and I think most contemporary, if not all contemporary Aristotle interpreters, think that the active intellect is some kind of faculty of an individual, right? So like everyone has a potential intellect and then they can gain an active intellect or something like that. I remember Spinoza was kind of like playing in that towards the end of the Ethics. But the earlier, the dominant interpretation was that the active intellect is something superhuman, right? There's one active intellect, and it sort of is in charge of the whole lower world. Now, again, how does it do that? Not like it doesn't change, but everything in the lower world is what it is because of its relation to the active intellect. And so medieval theories of prophecy, the early medieval theories of prophecy anyway, among Aristotelians have to do with like the way certain people can receive images from the active intellect. And I'll say a little bit more about that theory of prophecy in a second. But first of all, so Thomas Aquinas like inherits this idea that angels are immaterial substances. But on the other hand, he also inherits all kinds of dogmas about angels, such that you can't say that angels, these boring things that do nothing but push the spheres around. Right. And so, by the way, and Thomas, this is actually one of the places where Thomas quotes Maimonides, although I don't think I included it in the reading. I'm not sure. But yeah, I don't think I didn't include this. I have in some years, but there's a question about how many angels are there. Um, and um, and Thomas's answer is there's lots and lots of angels, more angels than there are bodies. Um, but so one of the objections is like, you know, um, as Maimonides says, there's only a few angels, and the other places in the Bible where it uses the word, like the Hebrew word malach or the Greek word angelos, it doesn't actually refer to one of these things. It refers to, I mean, both of those words mean messenger. So Maimonides says many times it means a human messenger, or it means one of the forces of nature, which acts as a kind of messenger of God. Uh, um, and also Maimonides says in the places where it, you know, where it is talking about these immaterial things and it says that someone saw one of them, it means they saw it in a dream or a vision. You can't really see them. They're intelligible substances. It means they cause some, well, see, I said I was going to put off this theory, but I'm already going into it. It means they cause some kind of image, indirectly cause some of it kind of image in your imagination, and that's what you saw. But Thomas needs his angels to like literally do all kinds of stuff. They have to move around, they have to change, they have to interact with human beings, and there have to be a lot of them. So like this kind of intelligible substance is not sufficient for those purposes. Um, and so Thomas introduces basically a new theory of angels. I mean, I don't know if it's really completely new. I haven't looked into like what Albert, his teacher, says about angels or whatever, but I think Thomas is, I mean, he's called the angelic doctor. That's his like his nickname. And I think it's because one of his great achievements was the theory of angels. So, and um, so it contains various parts. So like one thing is that angels change. They're not so uh, they're not movable in the way bodies are because nothing pushes them from outside. Their change is an internal development of their own essence. So like they're in time in that special way that they develop their own essence as time goes on. So, I mean, obviously that should start sounding to you, well, both like one of Spinoza's attributes or maybe infinite modes, and therefore like one of Leibniz's monads. Um, Another thing he develops is the theory of how angels can be in space. So this is in, I should have printed out the reading from Thomas Aquinas, but I didn't. Where did I even open it? I know. Hmm. Just have to click on this link. I'll look here. Actually, this is dumb because I have that original file that's this link points to on my disk. Here we go. Yeah, so this is from the reading that's labeled B in the on the handout. I still call these things handouts because we used to hand them out. All right. Right, about whether an angel is in place. So it's the quaestio starts. It seems that an angel is not in a place, right? So that I don't think I ever got a chance to talk about this before because remember I ran out of time to talk about Thomas Aquinas, but right, like the structure of a quaestio is that you ask a question whether an angel is in space, and then you start with the wrong answer, right? So like it starts with, it seems that an angel is not in a place. right? So from that, you can tell that the answer, I mean, usually, sometimes there's weird things where the answer is like neither side is right or whatever. But almost always you can tell that if it starts with this, the right answer is going to be an angel is in a place. And then there's a list of objections. So the objections are arguments for this, for the wrong answer. That's why they're called objections. Um, and then there's a part called the sed contra, which means but against, right? Like it says, but against this. And in the Summa Theologica, which is his most important work, there's usually just one of these. And some of his other works, which are like, where the form is more drawn out, there can be a whole list of them. But usually the sed contra is like an authority. So in this case, he actually quotes something called the Collect, which I wrote in brackets here as Dominican liturgy. I'm not even sure that's right, but it's some kind of hymns or something. And it says, may your holy angels who dwell herein preserve us in peace, right? So from that quote, you can tell that angels are in a place because it says, may your holy angels who dwell herein, right? So the objections are arguments. And oftentimes they'll actually mention philosophers like Avicenna or whatever, but the sed contra is usually just an authority, like as Augustine says, blah blah blah, or in this, yeah. So um, okay, so and in this quaestio, the answer is that an angel is in place. I mean, the objections are pretty much obvious. It's an immaterial thing. It doesn't have, it's not surrounded by a surface. So in Aristotle, the definition of place is the surrounding surface of a body. It's hard to draw this on the board because it's the same line. Like, let me draw the board. The body actually takes up its whole place, right? But let me draw it a little bit smaller. This is the body, and this is the surrounding surface of the other bodies. There always is a surrounding surface because Aristotle thinks a vacuum is impossible. Not for the reason Descartes does, but for other reasons. So actually, one of the proofs that Aristotle has that there is no vacuum. This doesn't really show that it's possible. One of the proofs he has that there is no vacuum is that if there were a vacuum, everything would fall at the same rate. I don't realize why that's so fun. But anyway, so right. So if this is what a place is, then obviously an immaterial substance, which like isn't surrounded by substance, it's like by surfaces. How can it have a place? So after the sed contra, there's the respondio dicendum. I respond saying, right, and that's where the philosopher, in this case Thomas Aquinas, will give the right answer and their argument for it, right, as opposed to the authority that they, right. So I respond saying that it befits an angel to be in a place, but that an angel and a body are said to be in a place equivocally, right? So in a place doesn't mean the same thing when you say it of a body as when you say it of an immaterial substance that is an angel. For a body is in place by this, that it is applied to a place by contact of dimensive quantity, which indeed is not in an angel, right? So that's like a technical explanation of why you have to have a surface to be surrounded by surfaces, right? It happens by applying one dimensive quantity to another. Um, and the angel doesn't have quantity of that kind. Doesn't have dimensive quantity, doesn't have quantity, it doesn't have extensive quantity, might be a later term that I think is pretty much equivalent in this context. But there is in it virtual quantity, right? So the angel has virtual quantity. What does this mean? Well, remember when I talked about Spinoza and like his definition of virtue as power, that I explained that the trick there is the same Latin word virtus, was used to translate both the Greek word arete, which means virtue or excellence, and sometimes, in some contexts, the Greek word dunamis, which means power. So here, virtual refers to power, right? The angel has a quantity of power. It's not an extensive quantity. It's not spread out. It's an intensive quantity, right? It's like how, so to speak, like how bright the angel is, not how big it is, because it doesn't have a size. So there is in it virtual quantity. An angel, therefore, is said to be in a corporeal place by application of its angelic virtue, that is power, I put in brackets because that's what virtue means here, to some place in any way whatsoever. Right? So this is what's called virtual presence. This is usually called substantial presence, or there's other words for it. But as opposed to virtual presence, oops, I wrote presences. Virtual presence. So the explanation here of how an angel can be in a place is that an angel has some finite quantity of power, and it can apply that to a finite extent of things. Um, right? And as he goes on to say, since God has infinite power, God is virtually present everywhere, right? God can apply his power to an infinite extent of things, but an angel can only apply it to a finite extent of things. And you just draw a line around the things that it's applying it to, and that's the angel's place. Right? And so importantly, the angel itself is indivisible. It's indivisible because it doesn't have extension, doesn't have parts, it doesn't have parts outside of parts, so you can't take it apart. But its place isn't indivisible. Um, right, and here's Thomas talking about this later on in the reading. It's in the second quaestio here in B. About this, however, some are deceived. For some, being incapable of transcending the imagination, have thought of the indivisibility of an angel in the mode of indivisibility of a point, and have thus believed that an angel could be only in a punctual place. But they are manifestly deceived, for a point is an indivisible thing having a site. Remember, I said in Aristotle, the definition of point is an indivisible quantity having a location, or here it's situs, so I translate it as site. Um, uh, whereas monad or units is an indivisible quantity, not in a location or site. Right. So again, so Thomas Aquinas is saying, for a point is an indivisible thing having a site, but an angel is an indivisible thing existing outside the genus of quantity and site. So the only difference between Leibniz's terminology and Thomas's is that by using the term monad, Leibniz is implying that an angel, that a monad is something like a quantity. It just doesn't have a site. But the truth is, Thomas also agrees with that, right? Because he says the angel has a virtual quantity, right? So I think when he says it's outside the genus of quantity, he means outside the genus of quantity as it's found in sensible things, in bodies. Um, Thus, it is not necessary that there be determined for it one place which is indivisible according to sight, but rather there is determined for it a place which is either divisible or indivisible, either larger or smaller, according as it wills to apply its virtue to a larger or smaller body. So the whole body to which it is applied by its power corresponds to it as one place, right? So the place of the angel, and this is his answer to the objection. So the question here is, can an angel be in more than one place at the same time? And the answer is no, it can't. And one of the objections is, well, look, when those angels went and destroyed the city of Sodom, they were like, they destroyed the whole city at the same time. So they were like in many places at once. But the answer is, wherever an angel is applying its power, that's its place. So even if it's like a huge thing, like half the city of Sodom or whatever, that's the angel's place. This is, I think this region is as close to as anyone gets to actually discussing the question of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, which I think, again, is really Moliere. That's not like a real medieval question, but they do discuss how many angels are there and how much space do they take up. And Thomas's answer is, it depends what the angel wants to do. The angel can take up a lot of space or a little space. Right? So, and it's important, right? The angel doesn't have parts, it's indivisible. So it's not as if part of the angel is acting on this place and another part is acting on that place. The whole angel is acting everywhere in here. And it's with reference to that one angel that we call this one place. Okay, so that's kind of like half the background here. I mean, obviously, I could say a lot more about the Thomistic theory of angels, and it would be cool, but I want to get on to Leibniz. So, but okay, so the other half, I already said something about this, is the theory of prophecy. Well, okay, no, actually, there's two other halves. So I guess they're thirds, not halves. All right, here's the second third. The second third is the question of how angels can know individual things. So, like in Aristotelian epistemology, generally speaking, we have these two faculties, the intellect and or reason. I don't want to try to discuss what the relationship between those terms is, because it really depends on which Aristotelian you ask. But anyway, we have this intellectual faculty, and then we have this sensible faculty, this faculty of sense, right? And the basic idea is that we know individuals this way, and we know universals this way. And at least the usual process here is that first the sense acquires some relation to individuals, right? So like I put my hand near an individual fire and the fire makes my hand hot. And then somehow that causes in the sensible faculty of my soul, causes the sensation of heat. And so the sensation of heat is the sensation of an individual fire, the one that actually made my hand hot. But then, so in between here is another faculty called imagination, which plays some role here. And basically what happens is that by way of the imagination, this individual sensation, the intellect somehow abstracts a universal form off of it. Now, I mean, actually, it's a little bit hard to understand how this works in human beings. I mean, it's very hard to understand. Aristotelians have a lot to say about it. But this is the basic picture of how it's supposed to work. So we know both individuals and universals because we have both an intellect and a faculty of sense. But an angel, of course, being an incorporeal substance, doesn't have something like a hand that can be put near a fire. So like it only has an, it is an intellect. And you know, that's what Aristotle says about intelligible substances, they're intellects. Neoplatonists, so Plato seems to say that like what later people will call intelligible substances, I mean, I guess he does call it the realm of intelligible being, and that word being is the same as the word for substance. I don't know. Anyway, so what Plato says about intelligible substances, basically they're like, you know, they're forms, right? Like the form of a horse. It doesn't sound like an intellect. So actually, Plotinus does a lot of work to show that these are both intelligible forms and intellects. And in the realm of the intellect, the two are together. Okay, so anyway, so what everyone agrees, therefore, is that angels are pure intellects. They don't have a faculty of sense. So it looks like they can only know universal. Because the intellect is a faculty of universals. And, you know, so Thomas, like, at this point, I think, mentions Avicenna, like explicitly cites Avicenna. And so Avicenna said, angels and God know individuals only insofar as they're implied by universals, something like that. So it's like kind of indirectly. And Thomas says that's not sufficient because like angels have to be able to know individual humans and interact with them. Because, for example, like angels are supposed to guard individual humans. He quotes this verse from the Psalms, right? The Lord will command his angels to guard you in all your ways, or something like that. So, I mean, of course, Maimonides looking at that is going to say, well, that actually means blah, 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 right? You know, that, of course, angels don't, except perhaps for Moses, angels don't actually like relate to individual humans. But there's literal angels. So it could, you know, there's various things it could mean, but it doesn't mean that. But Thomas wants it to mean that literally. And I think when I say he wants to, he probably has to, right? Like he's under constraints. There's like a whole list of propositions that have been condemned that people suspect Aristotelians of believing. Remember, I think I said this before. I always forget what I said in what class. But, you know, nowadays, Thomas Aquinas is a saint and a doctor of the church, right? But when he was alive, he was like you know, he was part of a controversial group. Right? Aristotle, like the introduction of most of the works of Aristotle, the translation of them into Latin was very recent. They were still being translated, some of them. And moreover, they had, you know, first come into Europe through Islamic Spain. So they were first translated from Arabic into Latin. And then only later they got translations of them directly from Greek. So, and they came with these Arabic commentaries, right? So the Aristotelians were also reading Averroes and Avicenna, and also these ancient pagan commentators. So, like, this is a thing that's like suspicious, right? I mean, it's coming from pagans and Muslims. It's not obviously consistent with the Bible or with the church fathers. The church fathers are, in the latter cases, because the church fathers were kind of Platonists, not Aristotelians, right? So, yeah, so people are on the lookout. They suspect these Aristotelians of maintaining various heretical views. And there's actually like a list that was condemned at Paris, I think in Thomas's lifetime. So yeah, so he's probably not allowed to say that about angels. But I mean, the thing about him is one of the things that's so great about Thomas Aquinas is that even though he has to reach a certain conclusion, it's really hard to see a place where he's putting his finger on the scale, right? Like his interpretation is motivated by internal considerations in Aristotle, basically, and Aristotle's commentators. And he's really good at this. I guess is one way of putting it. So anyway, so the question is, so he has to say that angels don't only know universals, they also know particular singular human beings. So um 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 what was I gonna think about this? No, I'm trying to figure it out now. So the answer is Thomas says, well, so in all knowledge or science, there's an adequation between the knowing subject and the known object, right? Like the um, the subject's representation is adequate to the object. Um, and he says there's three different ways that can happen. So one way would be that the adequation happens because the object causes the representation in the subject. And that's the case of human knowledge, right? So the fire indirectly caused my representation of the form of fire by affecting my senses, and then I was able to abstract this universal from it. I mean, remember how difficult that is to understand, especially after Avicenna, when the actual form of the fire is not sensible. All I'm really feeling is its effects. But never mind that. So that's how that's supposed to work. Then he says another way would be if the subject's representation causes the objects. And he says that's the case of divine knowledge, right? So God, and he says, therefore, that's why God can know not only universals, but also individuals, because God causes things not only with respect to their universal form, but also with respect to their individual nature. I mean, there's more details of that have to do with his theory of individuation, like what makes individuals of the same species different from each other. It's, they have different matter, but that also requires some complicated thought, right? Because in some sense, it's all the same matter. It's all just pure potentiality. But anyway, so since God causes them with respect not only to the form, but also the matter, God God knows universals and singulars that is the adequation between God and those objects is by way of God being their cause. But there's one possibility left over, he says, which is that there's one cause that causes both the representation and the object, right? So it's like, here's the subject and here's the object. Okay, so this is human knowledge. This is divine knowledge. But then there's also this possibility. There's a third thing that's the cause here. And he says, this is angelic knowledge. Angelic knowledge is God creates in the angel a representation that's adequate to the object. And because God knows the object as individual, God can create an intellectual representation of an individual in the intellect of the angel. right? So in other words, the idea is that the reason our intellect only contains universals is not because intellection in general, whatever that is exactly, is inconsistent with representing particulars or singulars. It's because there's no way for our intellect to receive those that knowledge of singulars. But but the angel can receive it because the angel is getting it from a source that knows individuals intellectually. So the angel has something like an intellectual, it's something like our universal concept, like fire or dog or whatever, but it represents a particular individual. Okay, so this is like, I guess I would say, this is like the metaphysics part. And this is the epistemology part, right? Like, this is how can an angel interact with bodies, be in a place relative to bodies, etc. This is like, how can an angel know individual bodies? But then there's a third part, which is, I guess I mean, it's also epistemology, but it's the other way around. It's the question of how human beings can know angels. And this is the theory of prophecy. Right? So there's kind of a general theory of prophecy going around in the Middle Ages. And I already kind of alluded to how it works. This theory is really due to Al-Farabi. I think I've mentioned him a few times. Al-Farabi apparently was not translated into Latin. So people had heard of him but not read his stuff. But Maimonides calls Al-Farabi the second teacher, where Aristotle is the first teacher. So Al-Farabi is really important to Maimonides. And right, so this theory of prophecy, I mean, it has antecedents, well, actually in Plato even. But I think it was Al-Farabi who put the pieces together this way. And the idea is that a prophet is two things. First of all, a prophet is a philosopher. So therefore, a prophet has a very perfect intellect. And the intellect of the prophet receives forms from the active intellect. Or generally speaking, from some angel. Now, I think, what that really means is just that the prophet figures things out. Right? I mean, because thinking always involves the active intellect. Right? It means that it's not because he doesn't believe in the active intellect, but because the active intellect is always involved with thinking. Every time I have a form in my mind, it has to be supplied by the active intellect. So a philosopher who has a really developed intellect receives forms from the active intellect and is thereby enabled to understand. Well, I mean, this partly enables them to like predict things about what's going to happen down here, right? Like that side of prophecy. That's basically knowing the effect through the cause. Okay. But it also allows them to contemplate intelligible things like angels and God, right? But so that's one part of being a prophet, but not every good philosopher is a prophet. To be a prophet, you also have to have a really perfect imagination, this faculty here. So the imagination basically is the ability to represent something sensible even when it's not actually there. So like memory and dreaming are functions of the imagination. And Al-Farabi says that what happens in a prophet is that the prophet, because of having a very perfect imagination, is able to translate these intelligible forms into images that represent them. And then that's really useful for a prophet, because then what you do is all the people who are not philosophers, who are not capable, their intellects are kind of crappy, and they're not able to understand these things directly, you give them the image. And this is how the prophet founds a religion and a state. Right? Because these people are thinking especially about Muhammad and Moses as like prophet lawgivers. Right. They're also thinking about Plato's Republic. And Plato says in the Republic that the philosophers who rule the Republic, so to speak, ascend to the realm of the forms, and they see things there, and then they descend and they paint images of them in the city. Right, so this is kind of an interpretation of how that works. So these images are like mythological type images, but also like laws about what to do with sensible bodies. So this here is kind of the opposite of this theory of angelic knowledge, right? I mean, here we have God creating in the angel an intelligible form to represent the sensible. And here we have the prophet generating a sensible image to represent the intelligible. Now, it's not completely symmetrical yet, but when I say what Thomas does with it, so because Thomas wants to say more than wants an angel to be able to have a place in a stronger sense than this. I mean, this place is the angels only temporarily and by accident. Right? So, I mean, you could, in a way, call this the angel's body, the place where it is right now. But this body belongs to it only in a very loose way. It's connected to it as its motor, the thing that's moving it right now. And since what's moving it now might not be what's moving it later, like its connection to its motor is loose. It's a very weak way of having a body. And Thomas wants to explain in what sense an angel can assume a body so that the body really will be the angel's body somehow. And when you see the body, in some sense, you really are seeing the angel. Like, how can that work? So he says, where is this? This is in reply to the second objection on the question. And the question is whether angels assume bodies, right? So it seems that angels do not assume bodies, etc. Right? The reply to the second objection. An assumed body is united to the angel, not indeed as to a form, right? So the angel is not the soul of the body. That would mean that the angel is a corporeal animal, right? If the angel actually were the soul of a body, it would mean that the angel's relationship to its body is like our relationship to our body. It's not that. So is not indeed as to a form, nor only as to a motor, but as to a motor represented by an assumed movable body. For just as in the Holy Scriptures, the properties of intelligible things are described under similitudes with sensible things, right? So that's talking about this theory of prophecy. He's saying in the Holy Scriptures were written by prophets, right? And in the Holy Scriptures, we find sensible images of intelligible things that are fit for representing them. So just as in the Holy Scriptures, the properties of intelligible things are described under similitudes with sensible things, so too sensible bodies are so formed by divine power, such that they are suitable for the representations of the intelligible properties of angels. right? So just like there can be in the prophet's imagination, an image is an image of a body, right? It's a sensible image. An image of a body that's suitable for representing this intelligible truth. By divine power, such a body can actually be created, right? And so here's the body, it's like the body. So, right, and now it's pretty much exactly like this, right? Just as in the angel's intellect, so if here's some random body, in the angel's intellect, God created an intelligible form that's suitable for representing this body. And that's the connection between this angel and this body that it knows. Similarly, here, God created a body that's suitable for representing the intelligible nature of the angel. And that's the connection between the angel and this body, which it assumes. So it's not just a body that it happens to be moving now. It's a body that was created specifically to represent this angel. And so when you see that body, you are seeing the angel in a sense, right? You're seeing the correct representation of that angel to sensible, to the senses. Um, Now, you can see a couple of things about this. First of all, as to the individuation of bodies, which remember is such a problem for Descartes, and actually kind of a problem for Thomas too. But how angels are individuated is not a problem for Thomas, because he says each angel is its own lowest species. So, right, I mean, precisely because they're incorporeal things. They're they can't be ones that are just like each other, only they're in different places at the same time, which is what numerical difference is like. So two angels that are just like each other would have to be the same angel. So each angel is a lowest species of its own. So individuation of angel is easy to understand. Individuation of bodies is not easy to understand unless they're assumed bodies of angels. If they're assumed bodies of angels, of course, they can be individuated by the angels that they represent. So if we want to know why is this one body and this is another body, all we have to do is say, well, this one represents this angel and this one represents that angel. And then the angels can be told apart because they're essentially different from each other. They belong to different species. Right, so it's like Socrates and Bucephalus rather than Socrates and Plato. It's easy to understand how Socrates and Bucephalus are different from each other because they're essentially different. They have different essential characteristics. If you ask what is, you get a different answer for Socrates than you get for Bucephalus. The hard thing is when Socrates and Plato are supposed to have the same essence. And then you say, well, but they're different because they're in different places at the same time. That is, they differ in accidents. But what is in different places at the same time? And remember, I was talking last time about how like Spinoza basically uses that to prove that there's only one substance. First, that there's only one substance of each species, and then that they're all the same substance. Leibniz takes that only halfway, right? He uses that to prove that there's only one substance of each species. So that's what the angels are like. So the angels are fine as far as individuation goes. But then when you're talking about assumed bodies of angels, you can understand how bodies are individuated too. That's one problem for Descartes. Another problem for Descartes is the mind-body problem, right? Like, how can minds and bodies act on each other when minds are incorporeal substances and bodies are extended substances? And again, it's really hard to understand unless you're talking about the assumed bodies of angels and the bodies that angels know. Because in this case, we understand how it isn't that the angel can act on this body, or this body can act on the angel. It's that God established a harmony between them, right? Like God created this body specifically so it would represent this angel. And so when this angel changes by its internal development, this body will also change. It will move, it will say things, it will destroy Sodom, whatever. And similarly, the reason the angel knows about this individual body is not because this body is acting, but because God created a representation in the angel specifically to represent the God. So again, when this body does something, this representation of the angel will reflect it because it was created specifically for that purpose. And so these problems can be solved altogether if we just assume that every body is the assumed body of an angel. Right, so then, like, angels act on the material world by moving a body, namely their assumed body. And when they know something about the material world, what they know is the body of another angel. Because all bodies are bodies of angels. And so, like, in this case, there's kind of like one step of pre-established harmony. In this case, there's two steps of pre-established harmony, right? Like this body represents this angel, and therefore this angel represents this angel. As it has the right intellectual representation of this sensible thing, but this sensible thing is the right sensible representation of this intelligible thing. So indirectly, this angel is really just knowing another angel. And that's how it works. But as you can kind of see from that last point, bodies are actually superfluous. Right? What's really happening is that representations of one angel are coming to exist in another angel. And the bodies are just like in between there. Because again, every body is just a representation of an angel. So this is the origin of the monadology. I mean, a monad is not exactly like a Thomistic angel. For one thing, Thomistic angels are all rational beings, right? They're all like super wise and intelligent, whatever. Whereas the monads, like most of them, in some sense of most, are non-rational, don't even have a memory, right? They're like these kind of stunned monads that are in a stupor group. So there's no angels like that. But leaving aside a few differences like that, Leibniz's theory is basically the world is made out of angels. Yeah.
Are there infinite angels? Because there's like infinite monads, right?
They're not infinite angels. Although, as I said, there are lots of angels, right? Like Thomas says that there are more angels than there are bodies. So it's not only is not every body the assumed body of an angel, not every angel has assumed a body. But I think he thinks they're still finite. I think he thinks that, I mean, there's some contrary. So Aristotle says that an actual infinite is impossible. There can only be a potential infinite. Some Aristotelians say that refers to bodies, not to intelligible things. There could be an actual infinity of intelligible things, but I don't think Thomas thinks that. So I think he thinks there's really a lot of them, but not infinitely many. But remember, he also thinks the world is finite. Right? Like this is this sphere of the fixed stars, and that's that. So, so it's not maybe surprising that he thinks there's only finite many angels. I guess also, so there's a third problem that Leibniz is trying to solve using angels that Thomas isn't so worried about, or anyway doesn't use angels for. Is that true? He does mention the continuity of place here. Because he does somehow have this in mind a little bit. But remember, I was saying that one of Leibniz's big problems is the composition of the continuum. Right? Like, how can a continuous quantity be made out of its parts? Because its parts seem to be points. The points have zero extension. And so you can't add them up to get non-zero extension. No matter how many points you put in, it's still zero. So in modern mathematics, we kind of had an answer to this, but the answer is basically to make it an axiom that you can have zero extension points to get a continuum. It's called the axiom of infinity. I mean, I won't justify it, but that's what it means, but, or even tell you what it is. But anyway, so so how can we do this? And Leibniz's answer is, well, body is everywhere divisible. But that doesn't mean that, so like, I guess you could say corporeal substance is everywhere divisible, but that doesn't mean every one of its parts, doesn't mean you can divide it arbitrarily into corporeal substances. You have to divide it in the right way. Remember, this was something I felt like Spinoza probably doesn't think, right? So when Spinoza says every body has a mind, he probably thinks you can divide up bodies in arbitrary ways. But Leibniz thinks, no, so like, if you have a big body that looks homogeneous, if you look close enough, you would see small organized bodies. Like fish in a fish pond sense. Right, so when you're far away from the fish pond, you just see a confused mass. When you get close enough, you can see the individual fish. So these fish are actual parts of this body. What about the water in between them? Leibniz says, if you looked closer, you would see smaller fish. And there's water in between those, but if you looked closer, you would see even smaller fish. And similarly, if you looked inside the body of one of these fish, you would see it's made out of little fish. I mean, obviously the discoveries with the microscope helped lend some credibility to this, right? When they realized that big living things seem to be made out of little ones. But Leibniz, adds something that you can't determine with a microscope, namely that wherever you look, if you look close enough, you'll see little living things. And each one of those will be composed of smaller things and so forth. So, I mean, this kind of, so to speak, top-down composition of the continuum avoids the paradox. There's infinitely many parts, but none of them have zero extension. And it works because, precisely because the place of a monad is not a point. It's the place of the big monad. So like, let's start with something that actually is not a mere aggregate, but is a corporeal substance. So the place of the big monad is this whole body, right? It's indivisible, but it's not like really small. On the contrary, because of its virtual quantity, because of how much power it has, that is how clear and distinct its perceptions are, it occupies a big place. But then there's other subordinate monads. that have smaller places that are in here. And Leibniz says, now don't get me wrong, he says, that doesn't mean that this monad always dominates these monads forever. Because, as Spinoza already says, this big body is like indifferent to exactly what parts are there, as long as they have a certain relation to each other, right? So this body, so over time, these small bodies pass in and out of the big body and are replaced by other ones, right? So like this big fish like eats stuff and poops and whatever. So these monads aren't always dominated by this monad. Later on, there's somewhere else, and there's new monads. But this monad, but there's always some subordinate monads, right? And they always have subordinate monads. And so again, you have like a top-down composition of the continuum. I mean, as Bertrand Russell points out, so one of Bertrand Russell's earliest books was about Leibniz, actually. And he points out, I mean, I think Leibniz himself almost says as much as this, that you could look at this as like corresponding to the rational numbers. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. But like, so it's not really, it's not a true continuum. It's like the rational line, right? But so, you know, so but rational numbers are depths. That is, between any two rational numbers, there's always another one. And that, like, I think from Leibniz's point of view, that's enough to solve the problem. There's, you know, there's like points everywhere, but there's no substance of zero size. So this, what I've been talking about here is kind of like, it's kind of like the first way of understanding the monadology. It's the more popular, that is easier to understand in terms of common, like common sense way of seeing the monadology, where you say, like, you think we're still in Plato world, essentially. Something like it, but with Thomistic angels up here. Right? So this is the intelligible realm, and this is the sensible realm. And down here, there's bodies. And we explain the relationship between them as follows. Like each one of these monads has a assumed body on which it acts in the sense that God created this body in order to represent this monad. Right? That's the pre-established harmony. So there's a pre-established harmony between what bodies do and what monads do. And the monads go from passing state of perception to passing state of perception. And meanwhile, the bodies down here develop in an exactly parallel way. And the assumed body of every monad is always an organic body. That is, its parts always are somehow like means to its end. What's its end? Its end is to represent this monad. And the monad's end is just to be itself, right? Like to develop its own nature. That's its conatus. So the monad like continually strives to represent its own nature. And this body continually strives to represent that. And it does that using its organs or tools, right? This is a Greek word, organon, means like tools or equipment. So it's an organized body. It has organs, that is tools that it uses to attain its purpose. And its purpose is to keep representing this monad. Yeah.
Monads can like.
Well, I mean, so, like, spoiler alert, right? I said this is the more popular version. The metaphysically strict version gets rid of the bodies or puts them inside the monads, is another way of putting it. But let me finish describing this way first, because it is easier to understand this way, right? So, so each one of these bodies, and the monad knows about other bodies because of the ways they affect this one. Just like in Spinoza, right? And since in a plenum, right, there's, again, I think I said this last time, a plenum is the opposite of a vacuum, right? So everything's full, there's bodies everywhere. In a plenum, Leibniz says nothing can move without everything else moving. I mean, that's not strictly speaking true. Because something can rotate and leave what's outside it fixed. But anyway, Leibniz says in a plenum, nothing can move without everything else moving. Maybe he thinks that's impossible somehow because of the principle of sufficient reason. I don't see why, but all right. Anyway, take the normal case. When something moves, something else has to move out of its way, et cetera, ad infinitum. So therefore, by knowing the way other bodies affect this one, this monad knows all bodies, right? But it doesn't know all bodies equally well, right? Like what it immediately knows and knows best is this body. Even this body, as in Spinoza, right? This is also like Spinoza's picture, where this is the attribute of spot and this is the attribute of extension. Just as in Spinoza, this monad doesn't even have a clear and distinct idea of its own body, because its body has parts that are not essential to it. And so the representation, the intellectual representation that God has created in this monad to represent this body is not completely clear and distinct. And the intellectual representations by which it represents other bodies by way of their effects on this one are even less clear and distinct. And as you move farther and farther away, they get completely confused. And again, that's why, like, if I look at that wall, I don't see the things that are behind it, even though they are affecting me somehow, right? Because every time something on the other side of that wall moves, some part of the wall has to move too. But, and the air in between the wall and me moves, and therefore my body is affected. But those effects are all confused together. So all I see is this blank expanse. That seeing is, so, I mean, here's the thing, you know, in this picture, there still is a distinction between the intelligible world and the sensible world, but it's no longer true that we have two faculties, intellect and sense. Really, it's all intellect. And again, this already happened in Spinoza. Really, it's all intellect, and what we call sense are confused intellectual representations. So this is good for a rationalist, right? We don't learn through the senses, because strictly speaking, we don't even have senses. And each one of these bodies is organic, and each one of these bodies is a machine. It's an automaton, right? Because again, these monads don't act directly on these bodies. What acts on a body is other bodies, and they act on each other by pushing. Any other way of acting would be a miracle of the highest sort. Remember, as Leibniz said to Clark. So they can't act at a distance or anything like that. They act by pushing. And so these things are like machines. They have, you know, this is the way, at least this is one of the things that you can mean by a machine, something whose parts act on each other by pushing. I'm not drawing very good gears here, but these are supposed to be gears. More like chrysanthemums. Anyway, I don't really know how to draw a gear, I guess. That have teeth. I'm really drawing them wrong. Anyway, there's like, there's like gears and other similar mechanisms in here, like hooks and, right? Because things can't actually pull each other, they can only push. So what looks like pulling always has to involve something like a hook. So, and Leibniz says they're just like our machines, only much better. Because in our machines, he says, there's a smallest part. So you can divide a machine often into parts that are themselves machines. Right? Like if this is a car, it has this part, the motor is a machine. And then, you can divide it into another part that's a machine, like I don't know, the flying train or whatever, right? But Leibniz says, if you keep doing that, eventually you get to pieces that can't be divided into machines. In one of our machines, right? Like if you get down to a gear that's made out of, steel or whatever, you'll find it's still divisible, but it's not divisible into machine parts. It's just divisible into pieces of steel. Right? And that's because our ability to make machines is limited, right? Like we can't make infinitely complicated machines, but God makes infinitely complicated machines. So every part of the machine is itself a machine. That's just, again, this same picture of how like every fish in the fish pond has fish in it, and the water in between has fish in it, etc. Right? But now thinking of a fish as a machine. Um, um, right, so each of these machines is the body of a soul or entelechy. Um, um, just like in Descartes and roughly speaking in Spinoza. Um, but now, unlike in Descartes or, well, should I say that? I guess let me put it this way. In Descartes, there seems to be a difference in mode of being or something like that between bodies and minds. I mean, the reason I say that is because Descartes seems to lean on the fact that the mind is unified in a way that the body isn't. That makes it seem like a step in some kind of Platonic hierarchy, right? Where like the form of horse is just one, whereas the individual horses are many. So the realm of the forms is a realm of higher unity. And Descartes, seems to lean on that fact about the mind being simpler, more unified than the body. But he officially says that substance applies univocally to minds and bodies, meaning that they fall under a common genus. So they wouldn't be really two different modes of being. So there's a kind of asymmetry or like apparent hierarchy that his metaphysics doesn't exactly account for. And there's a similar situation in Spinoza, right? Where I pointed out that assuming there are really infinitely many attributes, and we happen to only know about two of them, but there's lots of others, which certainly seems like what Spinoza says, then the two we know about, they don't seem to be like symmetrically related to each other. Thought seems to be a really special attribute because the modes of thought have objects. They refer to something. They refer to something in another attribute. Whereas we don't have the reverse relation, right? Like bodies don't refer back to minds. They don't have objects. And similarly, there's a related problem about how that the attribute of thought has to have ideas of modes of other attributes. And why is that a problem? Well, first of all, it means the attribute of thought has to be kind of like as big as all the other attributes put together. But also, I think this is more clearly a problem from both these points of view. Whereas Spinoza says, but this and this are really the same thing looked at from two different points of view. That's very hard to reconcile with either this lack of symmetry or the fact that thought seems to be a really special attribute that represents all the others. So in Leibniz, we have this, in this view of monads, we have that hierarchy and asymmetry, like officially part of the system. These are a higher form of being. These are a lower form of being. These are the form of being that represents, in the sense of like refers to. These are the form of being that represents in the sense of being an image of, not in the sense of referring to. So there's supposed to be an asymmetry here. Moreover, there's big differences between how these intelligible substances act and how these act, right? These actually act on each other. They cause effects in each other. They bang into each other. These don't act on each other. Rather, God keeps them in harmony with each other, or God creates them in the first place such that they'll be in harmony with each other, is the way I should say it, right? Because it's not, this is, Leibniz is always arguing against this alternative called the system of occasional causes, which says that when something happens, God like intervenes to create a representation of that thing. Right? So like when my hand goes near a fire, God, and it wiggles my pineal gland, God is like, oh, pineal gland is wiggling, better cause the sensation of heat. That's the system of occasional causes. And Leibniz says, no, God, is smarter than that. He figured out everything in advance. Right. So, and the monads are indivisible. Each one is a lowest species. So they're individuated by their essential characteristics, whereas the bodies are individuated by their relationship to monads. How much time do I have left? All right, not too bad. Right, so that another way to put this is the body is individuated and specified by its dominant monad. Or sorry, unified and specified by its dominant monad. I guess also individuated, but I was trying to say something else. It's unified by its dominant monad, right? So like the body itself has no true unity. It's divisible any which way. But it gets its unity from its relationship to the monad that it represents. It's one body in the same sense that this like whole big place was one place because of its relation to one angel. And it's also, yeah, I guess specified and individuate. It's made into a specific type of body by its relationship to this monad. And since the monad is a different type from all the others, that distinguishes the body from all the other bodies. And the force it has to act on other bodies somehow also ultimately derives from the monad. Now, I mean, it derives from it in the sense that this monad has a clear and distinct perception of what this body is going to do to some other body. And because of the pre-established harmony, that means this body will do that to the other body. So that the other body, this body, so to speak, like, or this monad has like the right to have for this body to do something to the other body. If it didn't, God would be a deceiver. Yeah.
Is this right in a deterministic way or in like the way of necessity?
Wait, what's the difference
The
between
monad-
deterministic and
Is it
necessity?
sorry, those are the same thing. Is it deterministic or is there a sense of free will in the sense that like, are the monads set to interact in their certain way to maintain harmony, or is it that in whatever way they act, harmony will be?
So, I mean, I'm going to discuss free will next time, but like what Leibniz has to say about it is really complicated. But the simple answer is, no, the monads can only act one way, right? Like the infinitely complicated essence of the monad determines what all its states will be and have been forever. The question is how to reconcile that with free will. And Leibniz has a way that he thinks works. Yeah.
So would like free will being the monad getting closer to its essence? As it moves on, it changes its form.
It's complicated. Let me talk about it next time. It's really complicated. I mean, in some sense, the monad is perfectly free in the sense that Spinoza's God is free, right? Like everything it does flows from its own nature. But Leibniz wants to get free will in a stronger sense than that. And that's what a lot of the Theodicy is about. But I mean, we're not going to read the Theodicy, but there's other things where he talks about it. Right, so all of that is on this picture. This is like the common sense picture. It's already, I guess, not very commonsensical, but it's like it says that the world that we think is there really is there. That there are corporeal substances, bodies. But as I pointed out, in this picture here, the bodies are kind of superfluous. And as you pointed out in your question too, right? What do you need these bodies for? This angel represents this angel. Why not just have that directly? And that is Leibniz's metaphysically strict view. So there's only monads. Now I'm going to draw them again. It's not confusing to draw them in different ways on those two sides. So maybe I'll keep drawing them this way. The problem is this way of drawing them. This is my usual way of drawing intelligible substances, but this way of drawing them doesn't leave room for showing their passing states. I guess I can like imagine little lines coming out of the wood. So what is a body? Well, first of all, I mean, in this monad and every monad, there's a kind of confused representation of the others. And as I've said before, like that confusion in full abstraction, if you just look at the nature of that confusion, so to speak, is supposed to be space. It's a little hard to understand that because, as Kant is going to point out, space seems to have like really special characteristics, like it has exactly 3 dimensions and various other things like that. But anyway, that space is supposed to be just that confusion. So, and the way this monad perceives other monads is confused in that way. So what it perceives is it's confused intellectual representation is a representation of something homogeneously taking up space. That is, what it looks like to see monads in a confused way is, and what it feels like too in other senses, but what it looks like to see monads in a confused way is the way things actually look to us. We see bodies with surfaces. And although, of course, there's variations along the surface, there's a smallest variation that we can see. So the surface is composed of very small areas that are completely homogeneous, so to speak, from our point of view. And again, that's because we can't see, we never have a completely clear and distinct perception of even a single moment. We're always to some extent confused. It's just like in Spinoza, right? It's just like what Spinoza says, our knowledge of individual bodies is always confused, but here now there's no bodies anymore. But our knowledge of individual monads is always to some extent confused, whereas we can know certain necessary universal truths completely clearly and distinctly because we're rational monads. That's like Spinoza's knowledge of the second and third kind. So, right, so in this monad's like imagination, that is, its confused intellection is a kind of, blob that has sensible characteristics. Is that the body? Well, not exactly. Because, like one of the objections Thomas Aquinas had to Maimonides' theory that the angels are just images, that when people see angels, that means they see an image in their imagination, like in a dream or a vision. And Thomas says, but look, angels sometimes appear to lots of people at the same time, right? Like these angels come to Abraham, and not only Abraham sees them, but Sarah sees them, and Abraham's whole family, I don't know how he knows the whole family sees them, but anyway, Abraham and some other people see them. So, and Thomas says, look, if something can be, if there's an image that many people have together, that's not an image, that's a body. So in Leibniz, that becomes the definition of body. The body is the kind of intersubjective constant between the different monads' perception of the same thing. I mean, because they don't see the same image, right? Like if I hold this pen up, you see one side and I see the other side, right? Or if you're much closer to it, it looks much bigger, right? And so on and so forth. So we don't all see the same image, but the images are all related to each other in a harmonious way, so that they make up different points of view on the same universe of bodies. And so a body is kind of a rule that regulates how all the other monads see it. And what is distance, or like what makes one monad distant from another? So, like, whereas in this picture, my perception of this monad is unclear because its body is far away from my body. In this picture, my body is far away from this other monad's body because my perception of the other monad is unclear. Right? It's just like turned around. Like what's really going on is images in the minds of different monads. And space is somehow like, or spatial relations are somehow based on that, right? So I said space itself is just the confusion, but spatial relations like near and distant, like have to do with how monads perceive each other. And similarly, action and passion are based on that. All right, but unlike last time, I'm not gonna unconsciously go over 5 minutes. Um, I'll see you one last time on Thursday. Oh, and I should tell you, I mean, I'm hoping this won't happen, but like all the other members of my family have gotten sick one after another. So it is possible I'm gonna get sick. I mean, it's likely I'm gonna get sick. Hopefully it will be after Thursday night. But if not, I might have to go to Zoom or something. So I'll, look out for a message. All right. See you later. Bye.